Hello, class. My name is Ashley Osagada, and for my spring honors project, I want to walk with you through the connection between Ida B. Wells' work in Southern horrors and the Red Record and the current political topic known as critical race theory. But first, I'd like to begin with clarifying a few key aspects. First, critical race theory, or CRT, is an intensely debated topic in today's climate. The objective of this presentation is not to debate the methods or ways by which it is or isn't taught in schools, but instead to dive into the highs and lows of African American history and see how the work of Ida B. Wells laid the foundation for movements we see today. Second, although her proper name is Ida B. Wells-Barnett, for the sake of continuity, I will be referring to her mainly as Wells. Third, throughout this presentation, you may hear terms like African American, Black, or occasionally Black Americans used interchangeably. Though we know that these terms carry a personal preference for each person associated with them, I want the emphasis to be that as a people who were fighting for equality in a land that champions freedom for all, they are all terms deserving of respect. And the most important thing to emphasize is that the skin color and heritage is something to proudly embrace and not to shy away from. Lastly, as you may already be aware, the subject matter discussed here touches on some triggering topics, including rape, lynching, and police brutality. Though I've taken extensive measures to handle these topics with sensitivity and respect, I cannot shy away from the truth no matter what. So in the words of Ida B. Wells herself, the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. One of the most important things to keep in mind is that we can neither teach nor understand a subject unless we're first able to define it. And the definition of critical race theory that we will be working from comes from the Encyclopedia Britannica. CRT, as originally coined by a group of legal scholars at Harvard in the 1970s, is the intellectual and social movement and loosely organized framework of legal analysis based on the premise that race is not a natural, biologically grounded feature of physically distinct subgroups of human beings, but a socially constructed or culturally invented category that is used to oppress and exploit people of color. Theorists hold that inequality is a result of bad policies, not bad people, and that racism is inherent in the laws and legal institutions of the United States, functioning as a means to maintain social, economic, and political inequality between whites and non-whites. Simply put, it's a recognition of persistent racial disparity that is embedded into our laws. Some of the more widely discussed examples of this would be discriminatory real estate practices such as redlining, negligent healthcare practices, and policing practices such as profiling or the use of excessive force. So with this definition in mind, we can begin to look at the history of America and one of the greatest literary pioneers who waged war against the forms of repression Black Americans are still facing today. The woman who would one day be labeled by the FBI as one of the most dangerous Negro agitators in America, Ida B. Wells, was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi in 1862. To formerly enslaved parents. Now, after the death of her parents, Wells took responsibility for her siblings at the age of 16. In her autobiography, Crusade for Justice, she writes, "After being a happy, lighthearted schoolgirl, I suddenly found myself the head of a family." Her willingness to foster them stemmed from her passion to care for the vulnerable, which is evidenced in her writings. She worked as a school teacher and a freelance writer for Black newspapers before buying a share of ownership in the Memphis Free Speech. Wells married fellow activist and newspaper publisher Ferdinand L. Barnett in 1895. After losing her job as a teacher due to her expository article on the corruption in Memphis schools, Wells found her first love in writing and set out to investigate and report on the oppression of Black Americans, especially in the South. Now, Wells would cover topics such as segregation, lynching, and economic inequality. After the 1892 lynching of her close friend and two other men, Wells recognized the power of the press. Using her no-holds-barred approach, Wells fearlessly used her written work to take a stand against what she called Southern horrors. In her most widely referenced contribution to the Memphis Free Speech, Wells addressed the, quote, threadbare lie that Black men rape white women. She cautions in her article that the overuse of such an audacious claim would produce a public reaction. She says, "A conclusion will then be reached by which will be very damaging to the reputation of white women." Unlike most writers, Wells understood the needs and limitations of her readers, With over 80% of the Black population unable to read or write because of former slave laws, Wells intentionally simplified her work to reach as many people as possible, refusing to use a two-syllable word when one will work fine. Now, Wells' method of investigating began with gathering white newspapers as evidence. Because lynching had become such a common display of domestic terrorism, they were advertised in white papers to attract crowds. She would then meet with eyewitnesses and members of the Black community, where she would soon discover that not only were the rape charges false, but lynchings would also happen for any minor offense that would be dismissed if it had been committed by a white person. The publication of Southern Horrors circulated through the Black press and quickly caught the attention of white newspapers. In her exhaustive report, The Red Record, Wells meticulously catalogs and describes every lynching in the South from 1892 to 1894. This detailed account was written not as a stat sheet, but an emotional humanization of the Black men, women, and children who had been murdered by mob violence and vigilantism. By telling their stories, Wells restored the personhood of these victims so that their deaths would shine a light on what atrocities were being committed against human lives. In comparison to modern social justice movements, the Red Record and Southern Horrors were to the late 19th century what Black Lives Matter and the hashtag Say Their Names have been to those of us today, who are often enticed to blame the victim simply because they were presumably guilty of some offense at one point in time or another. On the other hand of that, apathy runs as rampant as in Wells' day when we pose the argument that the perpetrator was merely doing their job. Now, not willing to compromise in the war against Black American oppression, Wells was not only determined to expose the plight of the people, but also to show that despite these acts of terror, Black men and women have been advancing and contributing to the framework of America for centuries. It was this campaign in particular that set Wells in the international spotlight, thanks to the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. When representatives of Black America were denied an invitation to present an exhibit, Wells distributed 20,000 exclamatory pamphlets to an international audience. Her written protest sought to highlight that the success of America was built by centuries of slave labor. Once her work became known overseas, Wells was given a much wider audience with whom she could share the truth of life in America. But as with any writing, her work was met with both criticism and support. Now, the Black community felt that they had finally been given a voice through Wells' writing. She received extensive support from renowned leaders such as Frederick Douglass, who would become her close friend and mentor. After inviting Wells to speak at an event, the women of the National Anti-Lynching Campaign raised $500 to publish her work and aid in her efforts. This worldwide exposing of lynch laws and Jim Crow laws made way for an intervention in America, as the people of Great Britain were appalled at the revelation of what they had previously thought to be slanderous rumors. They published their own articles praising the tenacity of Wells and questioning how America, a country that boasts so greatly in its freedom, could be so oppressive as to burn their own citizens at the stake. Even though this international pressure would result in a decrease in the overall number of lynchings, the opposition she received was incomprehensible. Now, during the same era, the KKK had already established itself by violently attacking Black people and the whites that supported them. Though many had joined in her fight, most white American establishments were unmoved while continuing to turn a blind eye toward lynching. White newspapers such as the Memphis Appeal, a major newspaper that is still in circulation today as the Commercial Appeal, published statements aimed at Wells with threats such as, "We regret not having lynched the saffron-colored speakeress." Even prominent leaders in the Black community, such as Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, were unsupportive, claiming that her aggressive and militant approach were too controversial for a woman. Wells was often accused of jumping ahead of male leadership to the point where Du Bois moved her name from the list of the NAACP leadership, despite her being one of the founding members. So when we acknowledge that the connections between Ida B. Wells and critical race theory, it's important to recognize that the methods she used are still being utilized in a similar fashion today. A 2021 Pew Research review found that over 60% of Americans get their news from social media, with social media influencers averaging between 10,000 and 50,000 followers, but what once took days for Wells can now be accomplished in minutes. The rising trend of podcasts and live streaming makes it even easier to reach audiences without the need for venue space and travel expenses. This instant platform has been utilized to share information and shine light on the modern day issues of inequality still facing our Black communities. Now, according to the Equal Justice Initiative, between 2015 and 2022, 1,593 Black Americans have been shot and killed by on-duty police. While making up only 13% of the nation's population, the rate of these shootings is nearly double that of white Americans. The details of police brutality in America often echo the lynchings of the past, where members of law enforcement not only tolerated, but would also participate in lynch mobs. Like the BLM movement of today, Wells was indignant with the concept that the people in charge of investigating these murders were some of the very people who performed the lynchings. Wells' use of the red record and her findings are comparable to the recent work of Bryan Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative and the hashtag Say Their Names movement. The lynch law and Southern horrors of the past still have their hold over the minds of today regarding the highly publicized modern day lynchings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, and countless others. Ida B. Wells Barnett's parents had placed such an emphasis on education that it overflowed through her written work in investigative journalism as a desire to provide access to information on critical race issues to anyone of any education level. In her autobiography, Crusade for Justice, there's a theme of hope woven throughout her words, as she believed that the country was opening up by way of opportunities for Black Americans. It's this commitment to exposing the level of barbarity these murders embodied that she would make us rethink American history. As she writes, the gallant fight and marvelous bravery of the Black men of the South, fighting and dying to exercise and maintain their newborn rights as free men and citizens, is a story which would fire the race pride of all our young people if it had only been written down. The history of this entire period, which reflected glory on the race, should be known. And so, because our youth are entitled to the facts of race history, which only the participants can give, I am thus led to set forth the facts contained in this volume, which I dedicate to them. Now, Wells never finished her autobiography before succumbing to late-stage kidney failure. Yet ending abruptly mid-sentence is a very fitting end to her legacy. For in the same way, we must recognize that the work to be done in reconciling the policies of the past with the disenfranchisement of today is also unfinished. In acknowledging the ugliest parts of history in America, we're confronted with the truth that the events of Wells' time are not far from removed from us today. In a world that chooses noise over peace, one that chooses to complicate simple matters, such as basic human rights, we are desperately in need of an Ida B. Wells for our time. Though poets such as Amanda Gorman and Common are taking up the written word as their weapon of choice, the absence of Ida B. Wells and her simple method of being a conduit for truth is deeply felt. Her unpretentious devotion to expository journalism in the name of social justice is a gift that very few have been able to replicate. Wells found a level of power in writing that affected change in the world around her. And even up to her death, she never wavered or compromised in the face of any opposition. And it's this level of truth-seeking that should empower and advance the mission of the now controversial critical race theory. I hope you all learned something from this today, and thank you. Stop it.